Has your lender gone completely MIA this week? Well, maybe it's because their mom taught them that if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Unfortunately, that's not a real strategy, so I have to show up and tell you guys that it has been a rough week for mortgage rates. So if your lender's not calling you back, now you know why. I'm sure you've heard about the debt ceiling crisis. You'd have to be living under a rock to not. And I always find this to be a bit of fake news because at the end of the day, we all pretty much know that both sides are going to stop posturing and come to a deal before anything terrible happens. Maybe it won't be a good deal, but the truth is, the doomsday worst case scenario is very unlikely to happen, even though it's going to be blasted across every news cycle, every headline, and every talk show for at least 5 to 10 days. People love the drama, so they forget recent history and they even forget common sense sometimes. But what would actually happen if this debt ceiling debacle played out? So let's pretend for a moment that the US government actually had a budget. Yes, I'm being facetious there. Tax revenue only funds this budget for 75 cents on the dollar. So they have to borrow the remaining 25% to fund the rest of the budget. Well, if the government isn't able to borrow the money it needs because it's hit its debt ceiling, then some bills can't be paid. They go into default. I've seen estimations that Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, defense, and civil service salaries would have to be cut immediately by about 27% so that we could prioritize the payment of other bills. And usually, this kind of uncertainty would be good news for mortgage rates because people would turn to bonds and the demand for those would pick up. Well, it hasn't because banks have also had a rough go the last few months, and consumers are not coming in hot to their branches with deposits. They're choosing treasuries and bonds, and they're choosing money market accounts for a little extra security right now. So in all this uncertainty and to raise capital, banks are offloading bonds. And when there's an oversupply of mortgage bonds, mortgage interest rates jump about 150 basis points over the past 5 business days, and it's been painful. The FDIC also issued $114 billion in treasuries and mortgage-backed securities after the collapses of SVB and Signature Bank. So that's also supply of bonds in the market because they're offloading those assets. It's important to watch what kind of deal is going to be made by the government to avoid the debt ceiling crisis. Because if that deal has a lot of spending built into it, that's inflationary, and it won't be good news for us, even if there's a resolution. The next potential crisis, because I always want to teach you guys to be forward-looking and paying attention, is commercial loans. And I actually owe you an apology for not bringing this up sooner. Commercial real estate prices are down significantly, unlike residential, and commercial lending standards have been tightening. Many smaller banks, regional and community banks that are already having a tough go, have a good portion of their loan portfolio held in commercial real estate loans. And as the recession unfolds, this could bring really bad news for those banks if those loans go into default. Remember, when we talk about the residential space and we talk about a housing crash not being likely, one of the biggest reasons is because people have a lot of equity in their home. Homeowner equity has actually never been higher in the US. So unlike 2008 and 2009, when people couldn't afford the mortgage anymore and they were upside down, they were happy to clean their hands of that asset because it wasn't really an asset, it was a liability. Now, the difference between what they owe and what the value of the property is pretty big. So a lot of people, their home has been their forced savings account the past few years, might be the only nest egg they're sitting on. They're not likely to forfeit that to the bank. They're going to work hard to make their payments so they can hold on to that nest egg, to that equity they have. That's their money. The exact opposite could be true for a lot of commercial loan holders if the value of their asset, their commercial real estate, is upside down. So what else to watch and what to do with this information? Again, it's pretty unlikely that all of these worst case scenarios actually come to fruition. And truly, the bank issues, credit tightening, even the debt ceiling debacle should all be anti-inflationary. Again, as long as the debt ceiling crisis is resolved without a shit ton of spending built into the deal. So if you've been watching these updates religiously, and if you haven't, I'm going to start adding a link below so you can watch the previous weeks, then you know anti-inflationary is good news for the real estate market. Why? Because inflation is the mortal enemy of mortgage interest rates. So even though at face value of all this news, mortgage bonds have thrown a really big tantrum, a really big red one this week, long term, and by long term I just mean a couple weeks, these could be favorable events for mortgage interest rates and in turn, real estate. So I hope that you are now prepared for someone to bring up the debt ceiling this weekend at happy hour or a dinner party, and you will be able to educate them on how all of this week's news could impact real estate.